Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSDA podcast. I am Craig King, your host, your favorite host, your only host, unfortunately. And fortunately, we have your favorite guest, Patrick Kelly.
That's right. I have stopped listening to the new Taylor Swift album just long enough to join this podcast.
I have to figure out these buttons, Patrick. I think this one's applause. I'm going to test it out right now in the moment.
Let's test it. We can't hear anything.
We can't hear anything because I probably didn't turn up what I... Wait. That is not it.
Stop that one. That sounds like a Christmas...
And I'm not editing
That sounds like
up.
a Christmas Lifetime episode.
There it is.
There it is.
That's the Patrick Kelly button.
We've had sound effects for 3 years and we haven't been using that? Come on now.
I know.
Let's get into the content before people turn off the podcast.
My homework for today is to label each one of these so I know which one to press. Okay, let's jump right into it. Patrick, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Craig?
I'm good. So we had a busy week last week. Like I printed out your Legislative Alert Network and I said, wow, Patrick's fingers must be really tired. But then I was happy to see the 1 minute advocacy was fairly short.
That's right.
And you referenced in the 1 minute advocacy that it wasn't as detailed as your land, but
that's right. That's right. Do not tell the Sierra Club that you printed out that email because there's a lot of trees that gave their life for what's sitting on your desk.
Yep. You're right. So I think the most pressing thing, along with everything else you talked about, the Senate budget debate, which is going to begin this week. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. It starts tomorrow, Tuesday, April 23rd. The Senate goes into floor debate on the budget for next budget year.
So I know the Senate did much of what the House did, but there are some changes. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, the Senate Finance Committee's version of the budget, which is what the Senate will be debating tomorrow, is the budget that came out of the Finance Committee, picked up the core education K-12 investments that came out of the House. Most prominently, the salary schedule that came out of the Finance Committee is identical to the salary schedule that came out of the House. So unless the Senate amends that on the floor this week, which I would call unlikely, nothing's impossible, but unlikely, that salary schedule is going to make it into law for next year because if the Senate and the House both agree, then it's locked no matter what. They picked up a lot of the same spending priorities. They picked up the $2.7 million to increase the teacher supply check. They picked up the $20 million for school facility upgrades. They picked up the $10 million for the math priority project that Superintendent Weaver has been pushing. So there's a lot that's similar. The two things that are most dissimilar is, number one, the Senate budget includes a $5 million pilot project for strategic compensation. That's something that Superintendent Weaver asked for in her budget. It's something that's referenced in the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force report that came out last year. The House budget does not have that $5 million. And then the other big difference, the more significant difference, is without getting too weedy on how this happened because it's based on a formula to calculate a funding amount, the House budget increases the state aid to classroom program, which is the primary state funding mechanism to districts. The House budget increases that by $230 million. The Senate Finance Committee budget increases that by $200 million. So $30 million less of an increase than what the House is proposing. Both those amounts are reported to be enough to cover in full the state portion of the increase to the statewide teacher salary schedule. But the $30 million extra in the House budget could be really significant to districts because those are flexible funds, and that means that districts could use that extra $30 million to meet needs ranging from inflationary pressures to increasing staff salaries for staff that are not paid according to the statewide minimum salary schedule. So the big difference is simply that the House budget sends more money to districts with the capacity and margin for some spending beyond salaries. The Senate budget sends a lot more money to districts. It's still a $200 million increase. It's not an insignificant amount, but it is largely a earmarked, directed increase that would almost entirely be consumed by salary increases under the statewide minimum teacher salary schedule.
So I would assume PSDA wants the 230 as opposed to the 200.
We do. Our policy agenda calls for greater salary support for classified staff, for instructional aides, for our paraprofessionals. those individuals are not paid according to a statewide schedule. They're paid by local districts. So in order for them to get a pay raise, there's got to be available revenue within a district to provide it. And yes, local districts, about 40 to 45% of a district's budget comes from local revenues. So a district could pick up those salary increases from local revenues, but it's also true in South Carolina, again, without getting too weedy and wonky. State law makes it hard for local districts to raise local revenues because of the way Act 388 structures property taxes. In South Carolina, the number one generator of local revenue for school districts is property taxes. But Act 388 forbids a local district from taxing a primary residence for school operating expenses. So if you own a home as your primary residence, it does not get assessed property tax in order to support local school district operations. It can get taxed to support a bond referendum for new facilities, but not the annual operating expenses. That means that the only property that can be taxed to support local school revenue is a second residence, a business, or non-residential property, your car, your boat, something like that. Who that really hammers is small rural areas of South Carolina.
Yeah.
Because they don't have second residences. They're not Hilton Head. They're not Charleston.
Right.
They don't have a big business footprint. And they don't have a lot of high-dollar cars and boats running around the district. So they are limited in their capacity, which is why PSTA believes that additional $30 million in the House budget is important, largely to support those districts that have minimal capacity to raise local revenues to meet needs that go beyond what the increase in salary for state-paid or individuals paid according to the state salary schedule are going to require out of the state aid to classroom program.
Well, Patrick, I will say this. Thank you for getting weedy and wonky with your explanation, because I think many of our listeners may not understand that breakdown that you explained with second residence and property tax and what districts can use to tax or counties can use to tax to help supplement, their school district. And so thank you for that explanation. And so in your Legislative Alert Network, there is a mechanism for you to advocate for that House version for that $30 million. So we encourage you to do that this week as the Senate debates the budget bill. I also noticed anything else on the budget before you move
just
on?
The only thing I'd note is if the Senate doesn't add that $30 million in on the floor, which I'll just be frank, I think is probably it's an uphill climb to add that $30 million just because the Senate Finance Committee is bringing a balanced budget to the floor. And if you increase state aid to classrooms by $30 million on the floor, you got to pull it from somewhere else. That's hard to do on the floor of the Senate. So let's just assume that the Senate stays at their $200 million number. That state aid to classroom line then goes to conference committee, and they can pick either the House position or the Senate position. That's where I think that this probably ends up. But if the Senate does add it in this week, then that's locked, and it's not a issue for debate in a conference committee.
Good deal. Thank you, Patrick. One piece that I know a lot of our members have been following, regulation that I believe passed subcommittee on reconsideration of instructional materials. Talk about that.
Yeah, the state board instructional material regulation that would govern school libraries, classroom libraries, books chosen by student clubs to use on campus. That regulation is before the General Assembly. It was reported by the State Board in February, and the regulation requires legislative action, again, without getting weedy and wonky. I feel like this is the dorkiest podcast we've recorded. The way the regulation process works is regulations have 120 days for legislative review. If they don't get reviewed within those if they don't get reviewed by the end of those 120 days, they become in effect law. They have the force of law at that point. They're not a law, but they have the force of. But this particular regulation didn't make it to the legislature until there were fewer than 120 days remaining in this legislative session. The General Assembly ends on May 9th because they're all on the ballot in November. So what that means is if the General Assembly does not take up this resolution and this regulation and pass it by May 9th, then the process has to be restarted in January. Now, the state board doesn't have to go through the full public comment period that they went through this go-round, but they'd have to resubmit it in January for legislative review. So in this instance, the House Regulation Subcommittee has advanced the regulation to the full committee for review, and that's likely to occur this week. It would then go to the floor of the House. There's also been a resolution introduced by the House Majority Leader to approve the regulation in the House. But the Senate has taken no action on this so far. The Senate had it on a subcommittee agenda for this past week. They did not discuss it. The Senate Education Committee is having a full committee hearing on Wednesday morning. It is not on their agenda. So with 9 days remaining in the legislative session, nothing's impossible. Like, stuff's going to happen in the next 9 days, sure. But it requires action by both chambers. And right now, the House is making some forward motion, not terribly fast forward motion, but the Senate has not done anything to date on that regulation.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Patrick, and we'll keep you posted on any changes or updates to that regulation. Where are we with Senate Bill 125? Lottery enhancement.
Yeah, lottery enhancement scholarship. Exciting news that has made it out of House subcommittee, so it's now on to the full House Education Committee. Big shout out to PSTA member Jennifer Tenney, who's a teacher cadet instructor over at Westwood High School in Richland 2, who came to testify in support of that bill and did a fantastic job. The subcommittee unanimously approved that bill, so it now goes to the full committee. If that bill gets to the governor's desk this year, that would mean increased lottery scholarship support for any education major receiving Life or Palmetto Fellows. PSTA believes that's a recruitment tool, obviously. We also think it's a retention tool because it would diminish student debt burden for our future educators.
So there was movement on a few other education bills. One that I highlighted was Senate Bill 305 by Senator Young.
Yep.
So talk about that.
Yeah, so that bill would give work experience credit to a certified educator who has prior work experience prior to teaching in a related field. So the example I keep using is if I've worked in a chemistry lab for the last 10 years and I get my teacher certification to teach high school chemistry, we know that teacher pay is based in part on years of experience. So if I'm a 35-year-old career changer entering teaching, I start at step 0. I start at the bottom of the salary schedule. What Senate Bill 305 would do is simply allow that career-changing individual to apply some of that work experience time to their certificate so that instead of starting at step 0, they start at step 5 or step 10, which obviously means higher starting pay. The Senate, the bill as it passed the Senate was a 2-to-1 ratio. So if I worked 10 years, I'd start at step 5. The House subcommittee reported the bill. They moved it forward unanimously this week, but they amended it back to Senator Young's initial position, which was a 1-to-1 ratio. So if I've worked 10 years, I get step 10 on my certificate. So that bill is on progress to make it to the finish line, but if the House passes it as is, it would go to conference committee, and the conference would simply have to decide, do we want a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1 ratio? PSTA testified in favor of that bill. We want the bill to pass. We've surveyed our members on this ratio issue, and it was exactly an even split. Half our members like 2-to-1, half our members like 1-to-1. So PSTA's position is, we just like the bill. Let's get it to at least conference committee. Let's make sure it gets a chance to become law this year.
Yeah, that's good. That's good information. One that I really want to talk about in our final moments together. So 4280, there's movement, but then there's also an insert of 124 from Senator Hembry, correct?
Other way around.
Okay, other way around.
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
H4280, the Educator Assistance Act, we talked a lot about on this podcast. It's a top priority for PSTA. It was passed unanimously by the House in 2023. It has been waiting for a subcommittee hearing in the Senate. It has not received one. So what happened last week is S-124 is a bill the Senate approved unanimously in 2023 that's been waiting for a hearing in the House, and it finally got it. It was a bill introduced by Senator Hembry that would allow a public school district, a traditional district, to hire up to 10% of its staff from non-certified individuals, 10% of its teaching staff, as non-certified individuals. Now, those individuals would still have to meet some pretty significant qualifications. They'd have to have a bachelor's degree in the area they're teaching. They'd have to have at least 5 years of work-related experience in the field they're teaching. They'd have to go through background checks. They'd have to do initial training, and they would have to enter a teacher certification program within 3 years of being hired as a new non-certified teacher. So this isn't like some states like Oklahoma have basically kind of just thrown the doors open. This is a more targeted pilot program to address the fact that, frankly, we've got a significant teacher shortage, and there's a lot of classrooms in this state that are being, quote unquote, taught by long-term subs, or students are being put in virtual environments with no in-person instructor because there's simply not an applicant out there for these teaching jobs. So the House subcommittee, and Chair Lady Erickson, the House Education Committee chair, was chairing the subcommittee on Tuesday. They took up the bill. They amended the bill to include some things that PSTA recommended in terms of which schools and which districts could hire non-certified teachers and some of the training requirements involved. But then Chair Lady Erickson inserted the entirety of H4280 into S124. And specifically, the subcommittee did it. They had to vote on it. They unanimously did it. But the reason Chair Lady Erickson recommended it, in her words, was she viewed it as a twofer, that S124, as passed by the Senate, is about recruiting more individuals to the profession. But H4280, as passed by the House, is about retaining the teachers we already have. Right. And so Chair Lady Erickson made it very explicit that she wants to take care of the teachers that are there. So she sees the bill now as this hybrid S124 H4280 as a recruitment and a retention policy tool. And so now those two bills are one on the House side. They will go to the House Education Committee. If the Education Committee reports it, it'll go to the House floor. Chair Lady Erickson made it very clear that the language she inserted for H4280 is the identical language already adopted unanimously by the House. So what that does procedurally is, let's say that the House passes our new S124 H4280 hybrid, it returns to the Senate as a Senate bill that's already been passed, S124, which means it goes directly to the floor of the Senate. It does not have to go to committee. Now, the Senate could send it back to committee, right, but it could receive immediate action on the floor of the Senate. The Senate could adopt it, which means it's going to the governor. The Senate could request a conference committee. The Senate could also amend it and send it back to the House again, but with 9 days left in session, that's probably the least likely outcome of the bunch. But what this does is it, in theory, if the House can pass it, it gets the bill onto the floor of the Senate for debate.
Well, that's good. That's good to know, Patrick. When I read that, I was like, wow, that's very creative how they did that.
That kind of stuff. That kind of stuff happens pretty frequently in the waning weeks of the second year of a General Assembly, as a way for one chamber or the other to try to get their priority onto the floor of the other chamber. I think we'll see this happen a few more times, maybe not in education, but in other spaces in the last 9 weeks, which is why, just for our podcast listeners, typically you can kind of from week to week see the process of a bill, and you're like, okay, this week it made it from subcommittee to committee and committee to full. We may come on this podcast next Monday and we'll be like, hey, this bill is already on the floor. And it just skips processes because it gets inserted into another piece of legislation that's already made it through multiple stages. So people just got to keep their eyes open between now and May 9th, because legislators will try to use every procedural tactic they can to advance their priorities. And Chair Lady Erickson's made it clear. The Educator Assistance Act is a priority for her. And so she's trying to find a way to get it to move.
Good. Well, thanks for all those updates, Patrick. Before we end today, anything else you want to share with the group?
No, just, again, keep listening to the podcast, keep reading emails. Keep an eye on your email. There's some bills that could pop up. A good example of this is last week, the Transparency and Integrity in Education Act, H3728, that a lot of people probably haven't thought of in about 12 months because it's been sitting in conference committee for 12 months. On Wednesday morning, a conference committee meeting for the bill was posted for Thursday. And then within about 3 hours, the conference committee meeting was canceled. So it is likely that that conference committee could happen again, and it could happen within a 24-hour period of being announced. So whereas typically in the legislative session, we try to limit our legislative communications to members to Friday only in order to not deluge your inbox. These last 3 weeks of session, you may get an email on a Wednesday if there's something that is especially time sensitive that we may need some advocacy action on. So just keep your eyes open. If you see a midweek legislative update from PSTA, open the thing because it's probably time sensitive.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Patrick. And also don't forget to register to vote. The primaries are June 11th. You have to be registered 30 days prior.
May 12th.
May 12th. So make sure you are registered to vote. If you have any people in your family, community, school that may not be registered, encourage them to register to vote. Many of our elections are decided in the primaries. And so it's important not to wait to the general election, be engaged in our primaries here in South Carolina.
And Craig, let's give all those registered voters listening to this podcast the sound effect that they need. Let's take them out. I mean, if you're a registered voter, here it is.
That's for you.
Fantastic. We
I'm not
it out.
exactly sure. I'm pretty sure there's another button that would be appropriate, but I don't want to take that chance right now.
No, let's just go with applause. We don't want to boo registered voters. We appreciate registered voters.
There's a boo somewhere on there. We're not going to do that to you. But thanks, Patrick. It's been another impactful episode of the
PSTA.
Yeah, podcast. I'm Craig King, your host. See you next time.